Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second panel of the Regional Outlook Forum 2021. 2021 is a crucial year for Vietnam. The Communist Party of Vietnam will organize its 13th National Congress later this month. The Congress will elect a new national leadership and adopt a new national socio-economic development plan for the next 5 and 10 years. Whether Vietnam can achieve the goal of becoming a developed economy by 2045 will depend on how the new leadership roll out these plans. To examine Vietnam's political and economic prospects after the 13th Congress, we are very pleased to have two distinguished speakers from Vietnam to join us today in this panel. The first is Ambassador Tôn Nữ Thị Ninh, President of the Ho Chi Minh City Peace and Development Foundation. She is a former ambassador of Vietnam to the European Union, Belgium, and the Netherlands. She is also a former vice chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the National Assembly of Vietnam. Ambassador Ninh will speak about the political prospects of Vietnam and some aspects of Vietnam's foreign policy after the Congress. The second speaker is Mr. Nguyen Thanh, Senior Lecturer in Public Policy at the Fulbright School of Public Policy and Management and Senior Fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, Harvard Kennedy School at Harvard University. Mr. Thanh will talk about the economic prospects of Vietnam under the new government. After the presentation of the two speakers, we will have a Q&A session of about 25 minutes. However, you can pose questions to the speakers while they are speaking. But please remember to identify yourself and try to keep your questions short and sharp. Without further ado, may I invite Ambassador Ninh to start her presentation, please. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Talking about the political prospects of Vietnam post 13th CPV Congress is no easy task. This is not my field of expertise, but I will share my take. I would like to make 5 points on the political direction or perspective post-Congress. First of all, I'd like to remind everybody that the Party Congress is a significant, crucial milestone in the political life of Vietnam every 5 years. I'd like to recall the 6-party Congress that ushered in the Đổi Mới. And you may realize that although it introduced mostly economic reform and renewal, but the impact deep and wide was also socio-political. So let us look at the upcoming Congress, I think, with the same perspective in mind. When you read about economic measures, and I stand to be corrected by Mr. Thanh, you must remember that underlying all that is the socio-political implications, far and deep. I believe that the line set through the, let's say, the mottos or watchwords of unity, democracy, discipline or rigor, creativity and development encompasses the sort of all-around ambitions of the Party Congress. It's noteworthy that the notion of democracy is included. Of course, democracy here is so-called socialist democracy. I also believe that we need to remember that political processes in Vietnam are very incremental. And although there is no official admission of a separation of powers, the legislative branch, the lawmaking branch, has been asserting itself gradually. It is accepted now that the National Assembly, the legislative branch, can submit bill proposals for bills. And most recently, the National Assembly rejected the proposed transfer of management power over transport and communication from the Ministry of Construction to the Ministry of Public Security. You may also notice that there is question time where ministers and deputy prime ministers and the prime minister himself answer questions from voters, from the constituents, and from the members of the National Assembly, and these are shown live on television. The National Assembly is also supposed to exercise oversight, although it has little teeth from my personal experience quite a long time ago. The issue also that is challenging, politics in Vietnam is the issue of openness and transparency, especially regarding, the management, the positioning of posts of responsibility in the political apparatus. Now, a continuing challenge, I believe, is attracting talent. The party and the state have been speaking about attracting talent, including from overseas, for many, many years. But in other words, to support meritocracy. But my personal take is that this is making very small or slow progress. A case in point would be to encourage open candidacies, which is not yet part of the political life and process in Vietnam yet. I also think that we need to mention the issue of internal debating in the party. Now, I'm not in the secret of the gods, but I believe that if you want to look into how democratic Vietnam is at the moment, you would need to look into the amount of internal debating in the CPV. But at the same time, there are safeguards against autocracy because of the collegial leadership and the kind of balance in the manpower attribution of positions within the party. So there is a more diffuse power, which means that less tendencies towards concentration of power in the hands of one or two single individuals. And therefore, I would conclude by saying this part of my presentation by saying that the political process should show greater responsiveness, and the notion of opportunities should be made more available to the broad public. Now, regarding the anti-corruption campaign, I'd like to stress that its existential significance. In other words, is not a ploy, a tactical move. It's an existential threat to the party and the regime. And therefore, it's like the đổi mới. The đổi mới was not just a simple economic platform or regime, of reform. It was an existential measure or strategy to move forward for the party. I think that we need to emphasize the COVID-19, I think, has helped in this respect. The need for the party to enhance public trust because the broad public is still very distrustful or wary of how public resources, especially land, is being utilized and distributed and utilized. And finally, in this part, I would like to emphasize that if you may compare with neighboring countries, the political culture in Vietnam is less confrontational and less violent. It's collegial, as I said, and I would like to use the notion of it's very much incremental. Now, in the minutes that remain, I'd like to say a few words about Vietnam's, foreign policy perspectives in the coming years. And I will single out two issues, major issues. Now, of course, uppermost in everybody's mind is the push and pull of between the two major or uppermost global powers, and which means that for Vietnam, more particularly, even more than any other country in Southeast Asia, we need to balance. And here we balance through accommodation and pushing back or resistance, which we are very accustomed to. And here I'd like to emphasize that balancing and not counterbalancing. In other words, it's not weighing on one side to push back on the other side. It's developing positive or good ties with both superpowers. So balancing rather than counterbalancing. It's an act that requires, of course, lucidity, alertness, and deftness, especially in view of public opinion pressure regarding our northern neighbor. The second issue I'd like to raise is the significance for Vietnam of regional mooring, of anchoring itself even more and better and more effectively in the regional enabling framework. Vietnam's joining ASEAN was, I believe, a strategic choice. Remember that the early 1990s saw our normalization with China, our normalization with the US, and our joining ASEAN. And so Vietnam, right from the start, regardless of ideology, has been proactively supportive of ASEAN centrality and neutrality. Remember ZOCFAT. Now, the regional mooring or anchoring is particularly important with regard to Vietnam and the South China Sea issue. For us, it helps avoid being cooked in a bilateral framework. We don't want to approach the South China Sea problems or challenges in a purely or mainly bilateral framework. So the regional framework is a plus. And Vietnam has been taking a very proactive stance. The previous time Vietnam was chair of ASEAN, we were the initiators of the ADMM Plus. And now we are fostering the possibility of a regional office for ADMM Plus. And so I think we are making the most of the multi-track, the multi-channel approach. I believe that we need to make better use of the dual track of the official track, government, party, versus the people's track. The same as our northern neighbor has the official track, but has the so-called people's track of, say, the Global Times. So it allows, certain nationalistic voices to be heard through the Global Times. I believe, if I may share a very straightforward thinking of mine, that we need to be more deft in, making a better use of this dual track approach. In conclusion, if you look at how politics will work out within the overall framework of Vietnam's path forward, I would say continuity and mastered or managed adaptiveness for optimal posture and strength. Strength here, I mean both economic and socio-political. So in other words, I don't think we should expect sort of any dramatic sort of shift or change, but an assertive continuation of our commitment, I think, to manage change. My last word will be to say a very, let's say, noteworthy aspect of the upcoming Congress is that it really calls on the patriotic aspiration of the Vietnamese for the nation to rise after having been at war for so long and after several decades of trying to reform, to adapt, to integrate the global supply chain and the external world. So this is the time. Perhaps not, I don't want to use the word takeoff, which is an purely economic term, but I think obviously the leadership is trying to tap into this common aspiration to rise. And my take is that it will not be possible to do it only with economic success. It will also need to include greater liberalization and taking into account and broader participation, a more participatory approach, including and in particular regarding positions of responsibility in the party, in the National Assembly, in the government, and in the relationship, if I may say, between the state and civil society actors. I thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ninh, for your very insightful presentation. We will be back with you shortly. Now may I invite Mr. Thanh to make his presentation. Mr. Thanh, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Hiep, and thank you, Madam Ninh, for a very interesting presentation. Talking about economic performance and economic outlook, I mean, anywhere in the world now, we have to talk about the impact of COVID-19. But in Vietnam, even before the outbreak of the pandemic, the focus of economic policy in Vietnam for 2020 was the preparation for the Party Congress, as it is the final year of the 5-year economic plan, as well as the final year of the political cycle. So the focus was on the one hand, maintaining stability. And on the other hand, trying to get as much growth as possible so that the government could announce the achievement of the 5-year growth target. So for stability, the focus of the policy was on controlling inflation, reducing fiscal deficits. On the growth side, the focus was on carrying out the biggest ever public investment annual plan. So the outbreak of the pandemic, on the one hand, it was a surprise, but actually it's played in hand with the original plan. One was stability. So that's why the stand of the government initially was on risk aversion, control COVID-19 so that nothing can go wrong with the preparation for the party Congress. But also, as I mentioned, they also want to get as much growth as possible. And that's why there was a message, initially a political message, but actually into a real action, the so-called dual objectives, which sounded like very unrealistic early 2020, but eventually it turned into policy actions, meaning forget about international tourism. We need to close the border to make sure that at least locally, domestically, we can still maintain some form of economic activities. So that's turned out into a policy action, meaning strict quarantine of all international arrivals. If there's community transmission, then they impose social distancing and lockdown and try some form of new normalization of domestic economic activities. They know global growth would slow down because of the pandemic. One is spread it globally, but Vietnam is still an export-dependent economy. So the policy is to make sure that even with strict lockdowns, factories could still remain open so that no major disruption to manufacturing activities. Of course, there's no international traveling, but locally, they also try to implement stimulus measures. But actually, unlike many rich and also middle-income economies, the government knew that they could not embark on a very ambitious stimulus package because the experience 10 years ago when responding to the global financial crisis is that it would have consequences on the macroeconomic balances. So instead of doing extensive quantitative easing, they implemented a series of moderate policy rate cuts. In terms of fiscal policy on paper, they announced all kinds of measures to support firms and let off workers, but actually they are very, very limited both in terms of absolute and in terms of relative size. The main focus on the government in terms of stimulus measure was boosting public investment. And as I mentioned, that was already in the plan before the pandemic. And the focus was trying to speed up the disbursement of public investment project as the main weapon to stimulate growth locally. And in the end, it actually worked. The government announced just a week ago that GDP growth for 2020 is 2.9%, which is pretty impressive. I think Vietnam is the only economy whose size above $100 billion that have positive growth in every quarter for 2020. So what are the main key drivers of the 2.9% growth. Surprisingly, it is one driver is actually exports. Initially, everybody is worried about Vietnam because of the openness of the economy and the dependency on exports. But actually, the reform in the last 30 years has resulted in Vietnam having a very diversified export market, including the US, the EU, China, ASEAN, Japan, and Korea. So in the pandemic year, exports to ASEAN, to EU went down, but actually to the US and also China went up. So once things stabilized in China, Vietnam also benefited. The US is also see actually a huge 24.5% increase in export, and it shows that Vietnam continues to benefit from the US-China trade war. So I look at all the product line items that Vietnam export to the US. Those are the items that China suffer from the punitive tariffs from US, including electronics, machinery, and furniture. The second key driver of growth, as I mentioned, is public investment. So 34.5% increase in public investment. Actually, 2020 was the year that the government pushed out the largest public investment program ever. So the growth in public investment was more than enough to compensate for the decline in private investment and also domestic consumption, as retail sales were weak because of the pandemic, but actually because of the new normalization of economic activities recently, retail sales are also recovering. So basically, net exports, public investment, and recovering retail sales are the key drivers of the 2.9% growth this year. I mentioned export on the external front, but also even in the pandemic year, capital inflows are still positive for Vietnam. Of course, FDI disbursements are slowing down. There's some capital outflows in terms for portfolio investment and borrowings, but in general, Vietnam still receives significant FDI inflows for 2020. Not only greenfield projects, but a lot of M&As, particularly in the greater Ho Chi Minh City area. So I mentioned before, even though they tried to stimulate growth, but the main focus of the policy was still on maintaining stability. But of course, it helps with growth slowing down, credit growth slowing down. You don't have inflationary pressure. So the government was able to cut interest rates. One also particular issue in Vietnam was on the exchange rate management. So because of the loosening of monetary policy in the US, you see the dollar's weakening against almost all major currencies. But because of the focus on maintaining stability, the State Bank of Vietnam, the central bank, tried to maintain a tight US dollar and VND exchange rate. So in the face of continued capital inflows, it continued to increase foreign exchange reserves. So politically, locally, it was played as a success in economic policy, maintaining a stable exchange rate, increase international reserves, but externally, it created trouble with the US government. On the one hand, you have Vietnam continue to increase its exports to the US. At the beginning of President Trump's term, of all the countries that have the largest surplus, trade surplus with the US, Vietnam was number 5. In the final year of his term, Vietnam topped as number 3. And so you see the increase in exports to the US. On the other hand, you have a tightly managed exchange rate and huge increase in international reserves, and that drove the US to start an investigation. Is on the chart of on the Department of Treasury side, currency manipulation. On the US trade representative side is undervaluation of the currency that I will touch upon later. But so that's the story of 2020. Looking toward 2021, things look very positive, even though there's a lot of uncertainty about the arrival of vaccines in Vietnam and also the distribution of vaccines. But in Q3 of Q4 last year already show significant recovery of economic activity. So 6.8% growth for this year is very likely, even though the government is still very conservative of putting out a target of only 6.5%, because the policy direction is still the pursuit of the dual objectives, meaning that they still have a very watchful eye on controlling the COVID pandemic. So there will be no easing of international traveling, at least for the first half of 2021. Of course, this year we'll have the Party Congress this month, and after the Lunar New Year will be preparation for the National Assembly election and the new government for the next 5 years. So in terms of the next 5 years strategy, they still want a very fast growth rate of 6.5 to 7%, 2021 to 2015. The main strategy will be leveraging the free trade agreements that Vietnam have been implementing, including the recently effective EU-Vietnam FTA and the RCEP, the ASEAN plus 6, the so-called ASEAN plus 6. So learning from the lesson from more than 10 years ago when Vietnam joined WTO, this time with the new generation free trade agreements, the direction will be used these FTAs as a leverage to push forward politically difficult structural reforms and try to build market supporting institutions. Already you see less and less focus on keeping state-owned enterprises at the lead of the economy, but more focus on the one hand, continue to attract foreign direct investments, but the aim is to get the higher value added FDI instead of simple manufacturing. And on the other hand, trying to build up the local private sector, the larger private corporation as well as the SMEs, making them more capable of becoming suppliers to the multinationals. Of the review of the last 5 years, one of the weakness that was mentioned in various government meetings was the failure to significantly improve infrastructure, the kind of systemic infrastructure, including expressways and international airports and urban public infrastructure. So the focus for the next 5 years will be to use public investment for the modernization of key infrastructure projects in Vietnam. So I mentioned the big risk for 2021 was the tension on the rising trade deficit that the US has with Vietnam. As you can see on the chart, the deficits continue to rise, and the US government has already moved to investigate Vietnam exchange rate regime it looks likely that the US TR will make some kind of negative determination because the Treasury already labeled Vietnam as a currency manipulator. But the expectation is that the Joe Biden government will not focus on the bilateral trade deficit issue. So even though the US may put some actions on punitive tariff on certain industries and export items from Vietnam to the US. Under the new Biden's government, Vietnam will expect more cooperation. Of course, renewable energy, investment in LNG infrastructure, reducing obstacles to import American agricultural products will be on the agenda for any future continuing negotiation to make sure that Vietnam will respond to the US concern of the unbalanced trading relations. But on the other hand, Vietnam will also not expect the US will quickly return to CPTPP because TPP will not be a priority for Joe Biden. And although the China Center RCEP may put pressure on the US, so Vietnam will I think for now will focus on handling the bilateral relation, making sure that although there will be some anti-dumping and punitive tariffs investigations on various industries in Vietnam, but Vietnam will be open to any negotiation, including an FTA with the US. Although in the current US political climate, Vietnam will know that if it become active in inviting the US to FTA, it's also vulnerable to pressure from the US. So I think Vietnam will have a passive role in this one, unless the US really want to force Vietnam into an FTA. Otherwise, it will be just negotiations for Vietnam to import more machinery, including aircrafts, LNG, allowing American companies to invest in renewable energy and LNG in infrastructure to show that Vietnam does care and do respond to the US concerns about the trade relation. So hopefully, but still there's the risk that in the coming days, Mr. Trump government will issue some actions to show that he will do everything he can with all the countries that have the so-called unfair trading practices with the US and leave the Biden government to solve the problem. And that's the risk that Vietnam will try to avoid. And that's why during this investigation, the Prime Minister of Vietnam, Mr. Phuc, already had a cold conversation with Mr. Trump to try to soften the issues and making sure that no drastic punitive measures will be announced
Thank you.
by the current administration.
Thank you, Mr. Thanh.
Probably I will end here.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Thanh, for your very informative presentation. Now we move to the Q&A session, but before I open the floor to everyone, I would like to ask you participants to do a quick survey about the prospects of Vietnam. It will take you only about 2 to 3 minutes to do. In the meantime, I would like to ask the two speakers 2 questions. The first question goes to Ambassador Ninh. You mentioned that the political process in Vietnam is very incremental, and it's a fact that the Vietnamese government and the party are prioritizing economic reform over political reform. Yet some experts and also some party officials have pointed out that some political or institutional reforms should also be conducted, at least to increase the efficiency and also the responsiveness of the political system. So in your opinion, to what extent do you think the party is interested in political or institutional reforms, and what are the kinds of reforms that you envision the Vietnamese Communist Party and its government will undertake in the next 5 to 10 years? My second question goes to Mr. Thanh. As you mentioned in your slides, some expect that the Biden administration will not focus on the bilateral trade deficit issue, but in the worst case scenario, if they do, what do you think are the consequences for Vietnam and especially for foreign investors in Vietnam? And how should the Vietnamese government respond to this challenge? So may I invite Ambassador Ninh to respond first?
I don't think I can answer about the reforms that are expected to be taken. What I can say is that for a number of years now, in public opinion among intellectuals and experts, there's been talk of a need for a second đổi mới. In other words, the first đổi mới is getting out of breath, and some new thinking has to be injected. And by that, I believe is that you need more initiative and more say for the broader public. I also think that the party and the state are under pressure from the growing role, positive and less positive, of social media. The reaction has been one of wanting to monitor and to some extent control, but also trying to get savvy. And thirdly, I hope that there is serious analysis reading through the screen of so-called social media talk to take in the kind of serious messaging that the caring and thinking public is voicing. In this respect, I think COVID-19 is a mixed blessing. In one aspect, it has afforded the leadership the opportunity for transparency, in the early months and even later on, with going public with all the statistics and figures, and so that everybody felt informed about what was going on. So, but at the same time, because there is this sort of broad support for the way the leadership and the state has been handling the pandemic, it might, be less inducive to, reform further, thinking that, well, we are doing it right. So as I say, it's a mixed or dual kind of blessing. And I believe that we need to look at the upcoming National Assembly elections. If I may, one last point, and I'm sorry, I'm a woman, I'm going to mention gender. Now, if you want to look at political reform in Vietnam, I have said in several fora, in many fora, that Vietnam started early on gender empowerment and equality, but now it's becoming a laggard even behind, Laos. And so it was really great news when I heard that Mrs. Hong was, nominated as the governor of the state bank. We need more women in the executive branch. I'm not mentioning the legislative, where we're doing all right for the time being, but the executive branch, it's being downhill from 3 ministers and minister level women to 0 after Minister Tien had to retire. So the first good news of the new year is Mrs. Hong appointment. I hope the upcoming government will include more than one, because one is still below what we used to to have. So this, I will end my remarks with this, if you forgive me, remark on gender empowerment.
Thank you, Madam Ninh. I agree with you on that point that we should have more women in the National Assembly. And because you have just mentioned the National Assembly, there's a question from Mr. Dien Leung, visiting fellow from ISEAS, that I think we should follow up now. You mentioned in your presentation that the National Assembly seemed to gain more independence or became more assertive in the past decade, because the National Assembly once rejected some bills from the government and also rejected some personnel appointment recommended by the government. But he argued that it was mainly because of the lack of consensus within the party and the government regarding those bills or those appointments. So in your view, under the next government, is there any room for the National Assembly to become really independent as a branch of power? What do you think?
To be very candid, the use of the word independent here, I think doesn't really apply. It's not really relevant. But I use the word assertive. It needs to have its own opinion and mind. At the end of the process, and I've mentioned the incremental, collegial, and sort of the consensual approach adopted for decades, by the party and the state. I think that more members of the National Assembly need to be tenor voices, individuals who really who know how to voice their opinions in a convincing and dramatic fashion that attracts public support. The question time live on TV, I think, plays an important role. So we need more of that. And on those question time sessions, we need those tenor voices to be heard. So I believe that we should encourage, the path forward would be to encourage, and therefore that's why, more tenor voices, meaning we need to elect more such members of the National Assembly. So to avoid being perceived, as just a yes kind of assembly.
I invite Mr. Thanh to respond to my question, please.
Okay. In my view, actually, the worst case scenario in the trade relation between Vietnam and the US would be for the US trade representative to announce some kind of punitive tariff measures between now and January 20th. And after that, it became difficult for the government of Joe Biden to abolish that measure. And the punitive tariffs, in that worst case scenario, the punitive tariff would not be on a limited number of export products, but would be significant, covering like 25 to 30% of the export volume from Vietnam to the US. In that case, that would put the economy on a very vulnerable position. So the US, as I mentioned, Vietnam has diversified export market, but the US is the largest export market for Vietnam. And in any case of a slowdown of exports, that would hurt growth, at least in 2021. The second thing is the signaling effect. Basically, the long-term development strategy in Vietnam is still pretty much dependent on economic integration and attracting more and more foreign investment. So any kind of trade tension will have a negative impact on the investment flows into Vietnam, not only on the short term, but also on the medium term. So that's why I mentioned that as a very, very significant risk facing the economy at the moment. But of course, I think the encouraging news is that the government has been very proactive in handling and managing this risk. So I think already one thing you know for sure, that Joe Biden, in terms of foreign policy, climate change and renewable energy will be big on Mr. Biden's item. And he already named John Kerry as his envoy on that front. So that's one avenue for Vietnam to work closely with the Biden's administration under the leadership of John Kerry. So the Mekong sub-region initiatives, renewable energy coupled with LNG infrastructure. So even during Mr. Trump's term, John Kerry was very active. He came to Vietnam every year, participating in the renewable energy and economic forum organized not only by the government but also by the Communist Party. So I think Vietnam can use that avenue to link it with the trade relations to avoid any kind of punitive measures. On the other hand, of course, the geopolitics, the message from Vietnam that the U.S. need to have a comprehensive relationship with Vietnam. Already you see that China has been scoring a few number of significant wins. The conclusion of the RCEP and then the EU-China investment agreement. So if the US still want to be significant in the region, then I think that's the thing that Vietnam can play.
I agree that a more balanced trade structure will be crucial for Vietnam to solve this challenge. And on that point, I would like to follow up with a question from Mr. J.N. Menon. So he said that the export boom in 2020 from Vietnam to the U.S. Was mainly in products that China had been exporting to the U.S. So he asked, to what extent could this be a result of the transshipment, where Chinese exports are rerouted through Vietnam with limited domestic value addition to avoid the punitive tariffs in the U.S. And if so, could the export figures overstate the benefits to the local economy? So what do you think about this?
So there's always a suspicion on transshipment, especially from the U.S. Department of Commerce. So in this fund, so on the one hand, I myself also look at the trade figures. So the items that Vietnam are seeing huge increase in export to the U.S. are not the items that Vietnam see huge increases in imports from China. So at least in terms of official number, the evidence of large-scale transshipment is just not there. Also, because of the suspicion, already the U.S. has been very active in asking Vietnam to be more open and transparent, but also you already see actually survey investigations, field visits from the U.S. side to suspected manufacturing sites in Vietnam that actually deemed as facilitating transshipment, and so far there's no evidence of large-scale transshipment. So that's why even in the investigation from the U.S. government, transshipment was not raised as a concern, but instead it was the currency manipulation and the currency valuation charges.
Thank you, Mr. Thanh.
And I think so in terms of benefiting, actually, I think the export to the U.S. is real, and it does benefit the Vietnamese economy.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Thanh. Now may I ask the admin team to bring out the survey result, please, so that we can have a quick look. So for the first question, what do you think will be the primary direction of Vietnam's foreign policy over the next 5 years? The majority of people thought that Vietnam will seek to reconcile the demands of both the United States and China. So I think that is largely in line with what Madam Ninh mentioned, that Vietnam should maintain a balance between the two great powers. For the next question, what do you think is the most serious challenge for Vietnam's economic development in the next 5 years? The majority of people think that corruption, red tape, and unclear business regulations. I think this is quite interesting. What do you think about this, Madam Ninh? Do you agree with the perception of the people here?
For the second question, corruptions, red tape, and unclear business regulations still exist. But then if you have to be objective, some of it has been pushed back. I mean, that's the whole point of the anti-corruption campaign. Now, the question is, it's not something that will sort of bring dramatic results overnight. So it's the perception from outside, I'm not surprised, but I think it should be a bit more nuanced, that if you compare now to 5 years ago, let's say previous party Congress, I believe that there has been, a change in the amount or the level of corruption. I'd like to go back to the first question, just 1 minute. I believe that the answer 3 and 4 should go hand in hand, not just seeking to reconcile the demands of both the US and China, but at the same time, deepening engagement with ASEAN and other regional bodies. That's what Vietnam's foreign policy has been doing, in the past years. And in the current context of this competition or rivalry or tension between US and China, this dual approach or combined dual approach makes even more sense. So my opinion would be 3 and 4, or C and D, not just C.
I think your comments have also answered a question from one of the participants about Vietnam's perception of ASEAN's role in this foreign policy. Now, for the third question, in what ways can Vietnam benefit from the US-China trade war? The majority people thought that it is the increased diversity in investment across sectors and skill levels. I think this is something quite also interesting. And what do you think about this, Mr. Thanh? Do you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of optimism in the Vietnamese economy at the moment, even with the impact of the pandemic. Is actually the shift in the regional supply chain, and so it's kind of in any kind of scenario, Vietnam will continue to receive significant investments. But then you realize, it's also the new strategy for the government is not like Vietnam will not be able to lift the standards of living of its people if it continues to be competitive only in simple manufacturing using low skill, low cost labor. So of course, I think the challenge is, on the one hand, is the upgrade of infrastructure, and the other hand is the workforce, and then you have
important question here. I'd like to ask for your views. One last question from Mr. Richard Borsuk. He said he asked what factors, if any, could slow or end Vietnam's great success in attracting investment and increasing exports. In other words, what are the challenges for Vietnam in continuing to attract more investment and to increase its support? What do you think? What are the challenges? I
think for the next 5 years is infrastructure bottlenecks.
Okay.
Right. So even I think that with the problem of corruption, unclear practices, but if they can solve the infrastructure, Vietnam will continue to benefit. But otherwise, you see already congestion in the greater Ho Chi Minh City area, the failure to build expressways, deep seaports, and international airports will won't put Vietnam off the map.
Okay.
Of the global
Okay, so infrastructure will be the key challenge for the government in the next 5 years. It's a pity that we have many interesting questions, but we have run out of time. So on that note, I would like to wrap up our panel here. Obviously, 1 hour is not enough to cover everything, and that's why we at the Vietnam Studies Program at ISEAS plan to organize a series of webinars in February and March to discuss the outcome of the Party Congress and their implications for Vietnam's economic and political and foreign policy prospects. So please stay tuned for our further announcements. And thank you, Ambassador Ninh and Mr. Thanh, for your time and expertise. And we'd like to thank participants, all of you, for your participation today. Thank you again, and have a break now. We will be back shortly with the third panel. Thank you.